Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 29th of August 2024. This mapping is probably a little bit out of date because I did the mapping yesterday evening, didn't have the energy to do a video, so had to leave that to this morning. And there will have been mapping updates probably from both Andrew Perpetua and Suryat map. So take that into account. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment. Really, the whole of I think the front line at the moment can be seen in the context of Kursk against Pokrovsk, and the question is, are the Ukrainians getting more bang for their buck in Kursk than they're losing in Pokrovsk? There are some worries at the moment that the Pokrovsk region, in that area, the Russians are now accelerating their advances and they are taking some significant territory where the Ukrainians are arguably slowing down their advances in the Kursk region. So you can see that, yep, okay, according to Suryat map, some slight changes there. No changes to Andrew Perpetua. They are still fighting for a lot of these places. They are still pushing. There are some claims from the Russians, actually, that the Ukrainians are there's no decreasing amount of pressure from the Ukrainians. Okay, so some Russian sources saying that, and also the idea that there is operational security still strong in the area, so that we might not hear about as many Ukrainian advances as we may like because they're keeping it fairly quiet. But then when you go down to look at the eastern front line, there are the usual areas, Toretsk up here and New York. Toretsk having slightly more, the Russians having more success in Toretsk at the moment. But, you know, that's an area of gain that is akin to what the Ukrainians have taken up in Kursk. And then you look at all of these pins in these areas. So these, I know it's a bit complex, but if you can draw a line with the darker pins, that was where the Russian lines were according to Suryat maps. And they've now gone up to these red lines. If you go for the lighter pins, that's the line that you draw from where the Russians previously were for Andrew Perpetua's mapping, and then go to the blue line. So whether you are looking at one map or the other, the Russians have made advances of differing amounts, okay? But broadly speaking, this whole area there has been taken. Likewise around here, so if you draw an imaginary line connecting these dots, bit of dot to dot, then you can see where the Russians were in this area, and they've pushed much further to the west. They're getting closer and closer to this road coming south of Pokrovsk, closer to Pokrovsk itself. A bit of movement northeast. I was talking about how they haven't advanced here for a long time, and lo and behold, they're now making some advances in that direction as well, although not up here at Vozdizhenka, which goes straight towards the T0504 highway. Anyway, that's a kind of, and you go down south, and Vuhledar is a worry as well. I mean, I think the days of Vuhledar being controlled by the Ukrainians are possibly numbered, unless there's a counterattack in the area. So the question is, what are the Ukrainians doing with their reserves? Do they have reserves? And B, do they have them of significant enough number? And C, are they keeping them back for something? Is there some kind of surprise attack that's going to take place? Are they going to do a Kursk somewhere else, like Crimea, like Kimberspit? I think that's insanely unlikely. You listen to Andrew Perpetua, he pours scorn on anyone that thinks that's even remotely going to happen. And I would generally agree. I just don't think the Ukrainians have enough. I think the Ukrainians are operating at max here, but I think the Russians are too, and they are throwing everything they possibly can at Pokrovsk, knowing that the Ukrainians are in a bit of a dilemma themselves. The Ukrainians have been trying to present a dilemma for the Russians, and the Russians likewise are trying to present a dilemma for the Ukrainians. And so we have exactly what I said several weeks ago. This is a game of military chicken. So the Ukrainians are pushing on in Kursk, hoping that the Russians will crumble in, say, Pokrovsk, and the Russians are pushing in Pokrovsk, hoping that the Ukrainians will crumble in Kursk, having to make the decision to move reserves from Kursk down to Pokrovsk, or vice versa. and we are still in the midst of that. The Russians have supposedly amassed a force of 30,000 or so Russian troops from up and down other areas of the front line and inside Russia with conscripts, and placed them in and around Kursk. So you are going to see Kursk slow down. That was always going to happen. This wasn't going to last forever and ever, right? The Russians weren't just going to go, oh, right, yeah, you can take whatever territory into Russia that you want. It was just a matter of when and with which troops. And we're getting an idea now that they're not prepared to move anyone from Pokrovsk. Okay, so that's my general interpretation. You can see here that there are some moves according to Surrey maps for the Ukrainians further to the west, just below the same river area. So these yellow lines represent fortifications that the Ukrainians in this area have overcome, and further ones being built south of Kurchatov and Kursk itself, and also up around the kind of Krupets area, up towards, interesting, all the way up there. I don't know why they would have done that, but anyway. Oh yeah, because that's a border, of course. Duh. I was thinking that's another oblast. Yeah, so that's an extension of this border fortification network that you can see going through the area that Ukraine have taken control of. So there's activity there. There's also a lot of fighting around Koronovo still. Unknown exactly how successful the Ukrainians are being in moving into the settlement. If we look at some of the different sources, first of all, going to go to Belgorod. Many Russian mill bloggers claim that Ukrainians broke through the Russian defense in Belgorod region and are now entrenched. That was a rumor that was pertaining to so if we go to the area, so pertaining to Shebekino, possibly having, I don't know, flanked where the Russians are, involved Chansk area, other areas possibly as well. Was it Nova? Where are you? Anyway, another village near the border where the Russians. Here it is, at the border crossing here. That the Russians may have been under a lot of pressure from the Ukrainians. Nekotivka, yeah. So I don't know if anything really did come of that. There were sort of counterclaims, claims that the Russians completely repelled the Ukrainians there, and claims that wasn't 100% true. So I don't really know. But anyway, that still possibly might have. There might be some activity still around those areas. Now, going back to the Kursk area, Russian channel report that Rilsk-Glushkovka highway is under the control of enemy first-person view drones. The highway from Rilsk to Lugov, close to Rilsk, is already starting to be controlled by the enemy FPVs. This is something that has been happening for some time. Actually, the Ukrainians have had some joy in controlling this highway. So this is Rilsk, there's Lugov, and that highway goes between the two. It's quite some way back from the front lines, but the Ukrainian FPV drones have some decent range, and they effectively have that under some sort of fire control. That's coming from the Russians. That's going to be super useful. And Syrskyi has spoken quite a bit on Kursk over the last few days. He's saying that 1,294 square kilometers and 100 settlements have been taken by the Ukrainians there. Quote, "We continue to move forward in the Kursk direction, inflicting significant losses in manpower and equipment on Russian troops. A total of 594 Russian servicemen were taken prisoner in Kursk region." So we talked about that yesterday, that 600 number. And that's what Syrskyi admitted. Now, Surrey Mat's a pro-Russian mapper says the Ukrainian Kursk offensive achieved part of its initial strategic objectives, but it has sentenced the development of the Donbass fight in Russia's favour. Only the relocation of these forces to their original positions could stabilise the front and slow down the Russian advance, but this would mean that the August offensive has only meant a waste of material and human resources essential for Ukraine in the defence of its national territory, which will affect the morale of an army and a population increasingly pessimistic about the success of this war. A drastic decision must be taken, otherwise the events of 2025 could be catastrophic for the country. Now, that's a pro-Russian position on the matter, although there might be elements of truth that you would agree with there. Whether it's all as catastrophic as Surat Maps would declare, I think there have been some serious objectives obtained here, and the discussion about Ukraine is back on the agenda. Mainstream media is talking about this in articles and on news channels. So the Kursk mission has achieved a wide range of objectives and is still doing so, but the question is boots on the ground. But then if these claims that the Ukrainians do have more troops they're not apportioning to any given area at the moment, then you're wondering, well, why, considering Pokrovsk is looking so precarious. There were some claims. Andrew Perpetua had a long ranty thread last night on that the Pokrovsk area, the reason why the Russians are making the gains that they are isn't to do with manpower and material. It's to do with NCOs and training and fortifications and other sorts of things. So, it's not necessarily just pertaining to this game of personnel chicken. Right, if we go to Null Reports and we look at their daily reports for Kursk, not much there today at the moment. A railway has been hit in the area. That's obviously going to hurt the Russians to some degree, as they are a railway nation. Ukrainian forces struck a railway in Lvov, Kursk region. According to local media, the attack targeted the railway near Lvov Kyiv station, damaging 2 residential buildings and affecting a warehouse belonging to a local business. So the Ukrainians are going to try and damage logistics for the Russians so that they cannot bring in material, and troops using rail networks have to use road and then hit those roads with those FPV drones as well. So I'm sure that's going to be part of their rationale. Now, in terms of mapping and what else is going on, as I mentioned, Koronovo, Null Report says Russian channels report that Alexandrivka, northeast of Koronovo, is under Ukrainian control. That needs further confirmation. In addition, it becomes more likely that the triangle of Vetrano, Zhebalovka, Durovka is also Ukrainian controlled, but this is only an assumption for now. So let's go and look at that. So that is, we are looking for Alexandrovka, and that's going to be northeast of Koronovo. So that's up here in this area. Now, if you see, that's all the way up there. If you look at Andrew Perpetua, he has a much more expansive control zone for the Ukrainians here than Suryat maps. I don't know, that might have changed since this mapping update. But as it stood, that is a really significant difference of almost 6 kilometers there. So something is not quite right with what Suryat Maps is interpreting. The claim there is that this triangle of settlements is under Ukrainian control, and that they might have got up here, but not through this area, possibly in a thin flanking move like that. If we go back to Null Reports, that's what you have sort of coming up actually through those 3 settlements, to be honest, and then attacking Koronovo from a number of directions and moving into the settlement from the south particularly. So that's not recognized by these mappers, but there's obviously a lot of activity going on there. So still, the Ukrainians are still very busy up in Kursk, doing what they can to expand or consolidate or expand and or consolidate their positions there. Okay, let's now come down to the what might have been the normal front line previously. Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea, slight advance according to Suryat Maps, just that field there around Pischany, which is on the way to the Oskil River, getting closer and closer to that river according to Suryat Maps. At least there's quite a bit of a difference between the mappers there. As we can see in a number of places along the whole front, they are disagreeing quite a bit in places. For example, around here on the way to that small village of Ivano Darivka there, around Spirna. So, yeah, and some differences there. Still a difference, interestingly, north of Rozdalivka, where Andrew Perpetua's mapping is more generous to the Russians than Suryat Maps. But anyway, there is a claim that came out today. Do I have it? Oh, dang, I don't have it. So there's a claim that's come out today that the Russians actually control 40% of Chasiv Yar. Now, if that is the case, then they control all of this, you would have thought. That would, unless this is being included, the Canal Microdistrict, as part of Chasiv Yar, then that's really worrying. We haven't seen any movement on the mapping. I don't know if the latest update will show something like that, but that is particularly worrying. I think that's come from a Ukrainian source as well. So, yeah, worthy of a note of warning there to keep our eyes open to what might be happening in Chasiv Yar, sort of under the radar. I'll go and see if I can find that claim. Yeah, here it is on Tim White's feed. It's been admitted by a military spokesman in Ukraine that Russia has now gained about 40% of Chasiv. Unlike other towns, this one is strategically crucial because of its height. Further south to the Donetsk front line, and Novohorodivka has been lost. So that's in the Pokrovsk area. But that is, yeah, if the Russians control 40% of Chasiv, that is a massive issue. And that's coming from supposedly a Ukrainian spokesperson as well. Then when we come further to the south, in the Torets direction, the Russians have made some advances into Torets, the outer suburbs, as you can see here, some of these dachas there, and then into some high buildings to the north as well previously. But yeah, filling in this sort of area there with Russian control. No change, at least according to these mappers, to New York at the moment. But they've pretty much got control of New York. I mean, further to the north of New York. And then when we come over to the Pokrovsk direction, you can see what I was talking about earlier. You know, just a lot of pins there, and it's all rather challenging for the Ukrainians. Right. War Translator said Russians are noticing the rather suspiciously fast retreat of the Ukrainian armed forces from the Donbass and think that something is up with that, given the availability of at least some reserves for the Ukrainians that are not being deployed. You can read some of their thoughts below. So I'm not going to go into that, but it is interesting. That's kind of what I was saying earlier, which is they do have some reserves, and there are, you know, there's news of people that have finished their training abroad. Then why is it that the Ukrainians haven't sent as many defenders to the Pokrovsk region as they might otherwise have done? They are, I think, putting some reserves into here. These people haven't been rotated for a long time. It is all rather desperate here, and they are retreating with increased rapidity at the moment. Is that intentional, or is it not quite a rout, but you know, things are that bad? But then, you know, why let it be that bad? Suryat Map says it's already difficult to speak of a war of attrition on the Pokrovsk front. The Ukrainian army continues to withdraw gradually without offering much resistance. It seems that the Ukrainian command intends to entrench itself in the Pokrovsk Minohrad conurbation and try to hold out there until November. However, given the pace of the Russian army's advances, it's difficult to know whether the stronghold will hold out until then. And this is where, you know, it's useful to know exactly where the defensive lines are. I showed you a map the other day, and some of those defensive lines do seem to have been compromised already, which is what I was arguing. The Ukrainians were ceding territory until, you know, so that they'll fall back to those defensive lines, and that's where they will hold out. But it might be that the Russians have already got past at least some of those already, which is incredibly concerning. Okay, we have an assessment of Pokrovsk from Tatarigami here. It is a couple of days old, but still, let's go through it. As Russian forces close in on Pokrovsk, a key logistical hub for Ukraine's Donbass region, concerns about its potential loss are mounting. There is uncertainty about why Pokrovsk is more significant than other recently lost towns. This thread aims to clarify this and other aspects. Before falling to Russian forces in February 2024, Avdiivka was vital for Ukrainian troops, serving as a fortress, protecting key logistical routes in Donetsk Oblast and a potential foothold for deoccupying Donetsk. Since 2022, Russia has invested heavily in capturing it. Pokrovsk, with a pre-war population of 60,000, lies west of Avdiivka at a key railroad crossroads. It has also become a key distribution hub, supporting Ukrainian forces along a broad front line from Vuhledar to the north of Donetsk and beyond. The railways are highlighted in red, so you've got Pokrovsk there being pretty important for delivering key supplies to much of this area. Otherwise, you've got to do this other railway line that kind of comes down through Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Konstantinivka gets towards Chasiv Yar. Obviously, they've been cut off from there to the east with, you know, war. But yeah, so the Pokrovsk is a super important logistical hub. Right, currently there are only two places in the Donbass region that serve this vital function, Pokrovsk and Kramatorsk. The significance of Pokrovsk extends beyond its rail connections. It's also located at a key road juncture, serving a similar role in the transportation and distribution of supplies. The road linking Pokrovsk to Konstantinivka has long been a Russian target. Cutting it off would worsen the resupply of troops in the Bakhmut-Horlivka sector. The potential loss of Pokrovsk poses an operational threat to logistics in the region from Vuhledar to Horlivka. So that's a T05 highway. Now my map has gone walkabouts, but basically where the Russians are moving to the northwest, they want to interdict that highway pretty much there. I was talking about how they haven't really got any closer recently, but they've actually got fire control over that road to some large extent, and that is such an important road that connects Konstantinivka and that whole kind of Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar and then semicircular cities to the frontline area here. So it's a really important road. Another concern is the political one. Pokrovsk is just over 20 kilometers from the Dnipro Oblast border. Given Russia's re-entry into Kharkiv Oblast in May 2024, there's little reason to think Putin will stop at Donetsk and Luhansk borders. Since July, the pace of Russian advancement in this area has quickened, allowing them to bypass most of the defensive lines in that Ukraine rapidly built after Avdiivka's fall. This is visible on the map by OSINT Group Blackbird Group, which uses satellite imagery to map defenses. And this is what I was talking about. Some of these defenses have been compromised already, and now Pokrovsk is over here, and this is the main defensive line, it looks like, although up in this area, I presume they'll be relying on the water features there to stop the Russians getting across. There's no need to build trenches, but it's these ones here that have been compromised that's pretty worrying, and also down here too. So yeah, it's just it's not great. However, you could argue that the Ukrainians are just allowing them to take land up to this general area there, and they'll be happy, scare quotes, happy to allow the Russians to take that land so they can sit in the defenses that have been built or that the natural landscape provides. Satellite imagery of seized Ukrainian positions shows signs of artillery shelling, though less extensive than in Ocheritina. This likely indicates that Ukrainian troops in the Pokrovsk direction retreated multiple times due to insufficient forces and resources for an organised defence. So this goes against what, say, Andrew Perpetua, in terms of it's not a personnel problem. While concerns about the lack of fortifications behind Avdiivka are valid, the major issue is a shortage of manpower and units to defend them. Regardless of how well constructed the defences are, if they are staffed at only 10 to 20% of capacity, they will be lost. Typically, both Ukraine and Russia redeploy forces to stabilize critical areas by moving units from quieter sectors. Ukraine's redeployment to Kharkiv and then Sumy for the Kursk operation has reduced the available units for stabilization efforts. Does this mean the loss of Pokrovsk is imminent? No, but the likelihood is increasing due to the balance of forces. Despite Ukrainian efforts to draw Russian forces away with the Kursk incursion, Russian leadership is hesitant to redeploy significant forces from Pokrovsk. Ukraine has options to stabilize the line, including deploying new brigades or reallocating battalions from more stable fronts. However, time is against the defenders and there is a risk of serious operational catastrophe. So you could argue that they are trying to play for time in terms of the weather and hoping that the area will become much more difficult to advance in, given the Raputitsa, the mud that comes along during particularly the autumn times. And that's where we are. So they are advancing apace. There are some significant fortifications and some natural features, such as the water features around here, that might allow the Ukrainians to defend more properly. But you got Mironad, Pokrovsk. It's all very close, really, now, isn't it? And very, very worrying, I think, for the Ukrainians. And then when we come on further to the south, as mentioned, you've got some more gains for the Russians in both Konstantinivka, this southern Konstantinivka, on that road between Vuhledar and the north. That is incredibly important, and then will give the Russians, if you believe Suriyat maps, they've taken control of the whole of it. That's incredible. And they will now have pretty much full control over this road. If you're looking at the red area of control, then the Russians really are in control here, and that is quite a quick, relatively speaking, concerning this whole war. They have moved relatively quickly from Solodka area to the west and taken this without too much resistance from the Ukrainians. Or at least, they've been able to overcome the Ukrainians. Vuhledar, I think, is incredibly vulnerable now. And the question is, will the Ukrainians do much about that? This is fairly key. I mean, logistically now that road is done, right? So there is that. It's no longer any use. So if you've lost it, do you bother trying to hold it because it has no logistical use? Do you try and retake it, which means pushing the Russians back to broadly this white line or grey line? Or do you give up on Vuhledar, thinking, well, actually, Vuhledar was particularly useful because it was a place that you could hit Mariupol with HIMARS, because it was in 84-kilometer HIMARS range. But now you've got longer range missiles, both indigenous and ATACMS. Actually, it might not be as critical as it once was. So there is that side of it to look at as well. Anyway, that's enough from me. Hopefully that was of use. Let me know what you think about the whole kind of Kursk-Pokrovsk calculation there. I'll be interested to know. Take care. Speak soon.